This is Neni line, and I'm gonna talk about why review scores are bullshit. With the Nintendo Switch out for more than a week now, most of the available library of games for it so far hasn't exactly been able to leave much of an impression. That is, all except for one. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild immediately hit the gaming public's expectations out of the park, garnering all around glowing review scores and a stellar aggregated Metacritic rating of 98%. Obviously, this was the Zelda game we had all been waiting for years. The perfection to finally outdo Ocarina of Time's perfection. A Zelda game that would be remembered as universally beloved and uncontested in its greatness for the ages to come. Well, not really. Within the first few days of the game's release, already a mob of angry detractors gathered, bombing the game's Metacritic page with ridiculously negative user reviews. In their own words, to balance out the obviously paid for by Nintendo perfect reviews the game had been garnering from professional outlets. Even though many of the people dropping these 0 out of 10 reviews admitted to never even having touched the game, let alone played it. Then, a few days later, fans of the game went ballistic, when the 70 out of 100 review from famous YouTube personality Jim Sterling led to the game dropping from a 98 to a 97 on Metacritic. The mob proceeded to arrest Jim Sterling, accusing him of, once again, having been paid off for his review, and finally DDoSing his website into oblivion for the following hours. Of course, it should be said that in both of these cases, these more extreme reactions to Breath of the Wild's criticism or lack thereof only apply to a small fraction of its fans and detractors. Otherwise, the number of 0 out of 10 user reviews on Metacritic would be in the hundred thousands, and Jim Sterling's entire internet presence would have been utterly obliterated by Zelda fans well versed in hacking. But the few loud voices that did speak up were passionate enough to make me seriously think about what it actually is that they are getting so passionate about. Are review scores really so powerful that a single slightly less than stellar score is enough to make or break a game's respect and reputation for good? Obviously they are, in the eyes of the people behind the incidents I just listed. But to me, the idea that a game's worth can actually be determined on a scale from 1 to 100 is more than just a little questionable. While I'm a very passionate gamer myself, I tend to personally be more interested in qualitative analysis of a game over a long term, rather than playing as many games as I can in the time given to me. In fact, out of my siblings, I probably have the lowest count of games I've actually played all the way through. As a result, I don't buy too many new games in any given year, so picking every single game I actually do buy is a very important process to me, since I expect myself to be stuck with that game for a very long time. Because of this, reading and watching reviews, additionally to getting advice from my family and friends, is an important part in my buying decision. However, it's rarely, if ever, the score of said reviews that influences my buying decision. The actual contents of the review hold a lot more weight to me. For example, when The World Ends With You was first released, it was a review in the German Endzone magazine that pointed me that game's way, and I ended up buying it. To this day, I remember the exact qualities of the game pointed out in the review, which led me to make my buying decision. However, what I don't remember is the final score the magazine actually gave the game, and whether or not it was an actual, so-called good score to begin with. Regardless, Trivia ended up being one of my favorite games of all time, and in fact, it was a game I enjoyed playing a lot more than the famous critical darling and 99 almost perfect Metacritic score holder The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And if you now come and tell me that's like comparing apples and oranges, then that's exactly my point. Looking at the YouTube comments and Metacritic reviews of the more extreme fanatics or detractors of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, you'll find many of them comparing the game favorably or unfavorably to the other two big open-world games released that same week, Horizon Zero Dawn and Nier Automata. The same is also true when you look at the discourse of those two games. Regardless of where you look, comparisons of Horizon, Nier and Zelda are almost unavoidable these days, and the success of one is often associated to the failure of the other. giving the deep impression that fans of the one are automatically incompatible with fans of the other, since in their eyes, if one is good, it must mean that the other two are objectively worse. Of course, that sentiment is utterly false in a reality where my brothers, Chirilon and Messiah, are spending their days sitting on the same couch, Chirilon playing Nier and Messiah playing Zelda, both of them getting along just perfectly fine and even exchanging friendly quips about each other's games. I took Chirilon aside to speak to him about my issues with the scores are everything mentality that seems to pervade the discourse around Zelda, Horizon and Nier, and he offered me his perspective. Even if Zelda, Horizon and Nier all fall under the same broad category of open-world games, from an artistic standpoint, these three games target entirely different tastes and needs, with Zelda focusing more on an engrossing adventure, Horizon on a technical high-quality experience, and Nier on storytelling and atmosphere. All three of these games excel at what they are trying to do, but they do so in vastly different ways, targeting very different player tastes. Regardless of how amazingly well executed all three of these games are, there will be players who will enjoy one or two of these games, but won't be able to enjoy the remaining one or two of them. It's a matter of taste, and just like how rating a ribeye steak a 9.5 in a culinary review and soy pudding a 7.0 won't mean that everyone, including vegetarians and vegans, will enjoy the ribeye steak more than the pudding, video game scores on their own, aggregated or not, will not give a player reliable information on whether or not a given game will be enjoyable to them. Regardless of what politicians like to argue, the fact remains that video games are a form of artistic expression, and art is not something that can be judged absolutely objectively. Guessing around a little here, I'd reckon that the threshold for how much of a game's score can be determined by truly objective factors such as playability, technical soundness, and working controls stops at somewhere between 50 and 65%. But even that is quite debatable, and as Jim Sterling himself once demonstrated wonderfully, a review based on such criteria alone would be utterly boring and useless to the consumer. And beyond that, it all comes down to personal enjoyment, something that is unique to every human being. No game will ever be able to evoke a sense of happiness, excitement, wonder, and true emotion in every single player who touches it. Which is a good thing, because it means that different game styles will always have to be varied and diverse in order to cover the entire potential of the market. But it also severely calls the validity and usefulness of uniform review scores into question. But if that's true, then why is it that most outlets use a scoring system with their reviews? Because we live in a society in which short, compact, easily digestible pieces of information are more sought after than ever. A review may be well written, perfectly worded, and have a million good points to make. The fact is that many people won't even bother clicking on it if they can't look at the front cover for 2 seconds or less and immediately think they know what it says. It's the same effect that makes headlines such an important factor in newspaper sales, and that made clickbait the scourge of the internet. Researching the psychology behind attention-grabbing headlines a bit, I found 2 important factors that apply to review scores just as much. A. They use numbers, which our brains love, since it seemingly presents an unchangeable truth and eliminates uncertainty. And B. They are often pretty polarizing, which again doesn't leave that much space for uncertainty. Just like computers, our brains, as much as we love to think otherwise, love exact instructions and have a lot easier time dealing with a simple yes or no situation than with more complex, context-sensitive replies to any given question. So as much as scrapping uniform scores for games and instead opting for more complex tables or diagrams would make a lot more sense to allow players to judge for themselves whether they'd personally enjoy a game or not, let's be real. No outlet is going to do that. It just wouldn't grab reader attention nearly as efficiently. However, as long as uniform scoring systems continue to be in use, it means that games that target very different audiences and have no business ever being compared to each other will continue being compared to each other, resulting in flame wars, name-calling, and incidents such as the ones I talked about in the beginning of this video. All of this happens simply because uniform scoring systems and review aggregators such as Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes encourage people to directly compare numbers and make them feel a need for their darlings to win out against someone else's darling, in the same way a sports fan wants their sports team to win over other sports teams, even though video game reviews shouldn't be and are not supposed to be a competition. Of course, people would still unfairly compare games to each other even if review scores didn't exist, but I feel like the existence of scores supplies these, in my opinion, useless arguments with ammunition and a fake sense of legitimacy that they wouldn't have otherwise. My close friend Triple refers to this kind of behavior as an obsession with meaningless numbers, and I can't say I disagree. In his opinion, the reason many players of more popular games cling to review scores as they do is because to them, it is a way to justify, reinforce and perpetuate the sense of hype they feel over a product, which they understandably get a kick out of. Now, feeling hyped and happy about a game is of course not a bad thing itself, but once it is paired with a sense of competition, it can get quite dangerous, and that's exactly what happens when overly hyped fans of a product compare its review scores to that of another product. It becomes less about which game you personally liked better when you played it, and more about winning against a rival team in a competition created by numbers that were never meant to compete. The act of comparing game review scores in and of itself becomes sort of a game. This also adds the issue that reviewers themselves, expecting scores to be compared this way, often account for such potential reactions in their final score just as much as for the game's actual quality, which I think has led to the average review scores for AAA games tilting unhealthily towards the 80% range in recent years, meaning that 50% is now seen as a bad score rather than an average one. This is part of the reason the backlash against Jim Sterling's review was so severe. He still uses a classic, and in my opinion much more reasonable, scoring system in which 70% actually means a good game far above average. Yet Metacritic counted his review as a middling one, simply because that's how 70% scores are read these days. In that way, it can be said that the backlash against Jim Sterling wasn't actually a result of him disliking Zelda any more than the other reviewers who gave it a somewhat higher score, but of him refusing to conform with the adjusted, skewed and limited scale of modern game reviews, which, come to think of it, is a very Jim Sterling way of tackling things. So, in light of all this, would it be better to get rid of scoring systems in video game reviews altogether? A defense of them came from my other brother, Messiah, in whose opinion looking at the review aggregators to judge the average opinion of reviewers on a game can be helpful to very roughly gauge a game's overall quality before you buy, as long as you don't take the aggregated scores too seriously. This may be true, but to me the fact remains that people do take these scores too seriously, and it leads to the existence of conversations that have no business existing. Whether or not aggregated scores' usefulness actually outweighs their inflammatory qualities is, of course, also up to one's personal viewpoint, but to me, I can't say I've ever felt as if review scores had improved my life as a gamer in any way, while the actual content of reviews definitely has. That's why nowadays I really do prefer looking at reviewers who don't use a uniform scoring system, or at least use one that's so out there that it can't possibly be compared to anyone else's. Do I think that we'll get rid of video game scores anytime soon? No, not by a long shot. The system is simply too convenient to be abandoned like that. However, I do believe that it is time the community took a bit of a laxer approach to them and focused more on the actual contents of a review rather than the final score given in it. I know that's probably not what will happen, but at very least I hope this video can make at least a few people consider what review scores mean to them as a gamer, and if they're really worth ascribing as much importance to as many people seem to do. If we as a community stopped reducing a game's worth down to numbers as much and instead judged it in the context of people's individual experiences with it, I feel like discourse about game quality would overall become a lot more pleasant and less competitive. I don't really think we actually need scores to judge the general consensus about a game anyway. I mean, nobody remembers the review scores for Sonic 06, but we still all agree that that wasn't that great a game, right? Personally, I don't believe in such a thing as a perfect 10 out of 10 game. What I do believe in are games that I loved when I first played them and will love playing forever, even if I grow old and my taste changes slightly. But of course, that Hall of Fame is mine alone and doesn't look like that of anybody else. Nobody will ever have the same combination of favorite games as I do, and I do believe that that's a very good thing. Now that all is said and done, I'd like to hear you guys' opinions. Do you think review scores are necessary and practical, or would you rather get rid of them? I'd really love to hear you guys' takes on this topic, so please go and leave your opinions in the comments. If you liked this video, consider dropping a like and or subscribing to my channel, so I know to make more of this sort of content in the future. That's it from me for now. See ya guys later. Bye!